Here in the studio is John Williams, formerly of this parish. He was one time my foreign editor. He is now the executive director of the Rory Peck Trust. Welcome.
Hi, Christian.
Let me read you the statement from the British government, which has come out in the last hour. Gravely concerned by the killing of Al Jazeera journalists and other media in Gaza. Number 10 says Israel should ensure journalists can work safely and report without fear. And they've called for an independent investigation. But we've had investigations before, and there is impunity for this kind of thing.
Well, we should remember that not in a single case of a Palestinian journalist being killed by Israel has anybody ever been held to account. Before October the 7th, after October the 7th. So talk is cheap. Actually, action needs to be taken, and actions speak louder than words.
Can you explain to people who maybe don't understand how journalists operate in a war zone, what contact there might be with the controlling power in that territory, and whether it's possible to work without that contact?
It's possible, but clearly for the safety of your own journalists. In Ukraine, for example, the day of the invasion of Ukraine, I gave the Russian embassy in Dublin, where I was working, the coordinates of our correspondents in Kiev, and said that I would hold them accountable for the safety of our team in Kiev. Now, in past invasions and in past wars in Gaza, the Israelis have been very good about actually respecting the protection that journalists enjoy under international law. Practicing journalism is not a crime. Targeting journalists is a war crime, punishable by international law. And the Israelis have been very good. But when it comes to this war, we know of at least 17 journalists who have been deliberately targeted and killed by Israel extrajudicially. And that's a truly shocking statistic when you think that journalists are supposed to be protected by international law.
But I want to explore this idea that journalists work very closely with a group like Hamas. Back in 2008-9, you and I worked very closely together. In fact, you helped me get into Gaza through Rafah. And when we went across into the hands of men with balaclavas, the Qassam Brigade, we were controlled by them. We were told where we could stay and how we could operate. Presumably today that would make me a target, but I couldn't have operated in Gaza without them knowing where I was.
Well, let's just remember, you couldn't operate in Gaza today because Israel won't allow foreign journalists into Gaza. And yes, Hamas is, as well as being a terrorist organisation, is also the government of Gaza, and it runs social services, it runs the media office in the same way that governments run any any territory. It is the controlling power in Gaza, and so there has to be a degree of cooperation just to get by. But it doesn't mean that your journalism is impacted by that. Whether you're a Palestinian journalist, whether you're a British journalist, you report without fear or favour. And the smears that Israel has directed at Palestinian journalists for the last 22 months, there's a pattern here of unsubstantiated allegations that not only delegitimise the individual, they undermine trust in journalism, and that's very dangerous for all of us.
The IDF says it has documents which, in their words, unequivocally proves his military affiliation with Hamas, including personnel rosters, lists of terrorist training courses, phone directories, salary documents. We haven't seen much of that evidence. We've not seen anything else which points to his involvement with Hamas. Would it make any difference to you or to people who've spoken out in objection to this if he were the member of a Hamas media team?
Well, let's remember there were 6 journalists who were killed this morning, or yesterday. Anas was one of them. And indeed, if they've got compelling evidence, they should publish it, and we'll see. But that does not justify the murder of 5 other journalists. To be clear, the murder of 6 journalists in a single incident is one of the worst attacks on journalists ever. If you remember Charlie Hebdo in Paris in whenever it was, 2008, or the attacks in Afghanistan when a number of journalists were killed in 2016, this ranks up with those attacks as being one of the worst incidents of attacks on journalists ever. And even if Anas was say he was a Hamas terrorist, that cannot justify the murders of 5 others.
What do you make, I mean, there clearly is an issue of proportionality, but what do you make of the timing? Because presumably he'd been into northern Gaza, they knew where he was, they'd followed him before, they could have taken him out at any point, right. But they take him out in the days ahead of an expansion of the operation in Gaza City.
Well, let's also remember that Anas had been very vocal in terms of the suffering of the people of Gaza in terms of being starving. You know, he fainted on camera. There was a video that went viral of him weeping on camera. And so for many people, as Yolanda was saying, Anas was the face of Gaza. And so to eliminate him takes him off people's television screens. And you know, in my experience, when people don't want to let you in somewhere, they've usually got something to hide. Well, you know, we're getting down to the point now where there are very few people who are left in Gaza who can actually report. We can ill afford to lose 6 journalists in Gaza, and that's what's happened today. And when there's nobody left to report Gaza's story, well, it'll be too late.
You and the Rory Peck Trust do so much for the families of journalists who died, but you speak out a lot about the threats that international journalists now face in war zones. This impunity that we've spoken about, how much risk do you think this puts journalists in other war zones, in other operations?
Well, if Israel is seen to get away with it, then people will do exactly the same. They will take a leaf out of their playbook. You know, Anas was unusual in working for Al Jazeera. Most of the journalists in Gaza today are freelancers. 80% of the journalists who are left in Gaza are freelance. And you know, we've managed to get some of them out to Egypt and elsewhere. But you know, they are at risk. And everybody is at risk if there is impunity. You know, in November, we have the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. And there are currently international criminal court indictments against individuals. They need to be seen through and they need to be prosecuted because killing and targeting journalists is a war crime. And if we just turn a blind eye to that, then what's to stop it happening next year or the year after? And all of my former colleagues in this newsroom will be vulnerable because people can see that you can attack journalists and get away with it. And that is not a situation that we want anybody to be in.